My name is Sevillana, and I studied how individual changes in activity level predict behavioral problems at ages 3, 4, and 5. So you can think of activity level as how much energy you're putting into your movements, how much you're using your major muscle groups. Whether kids are jumping in puddles or playing quietly with their train tracks, children are always in motion to some extent. Activity level is a component of child temperament, which describes the personality characteristics of infants and children. High activity level has found to be associated with externalizing problems, which are outward expressions of problematic behaviors like hyperactivity, lack of self-control, aggression, and defiance. And this can be thought of as a risk factor, a trait that affects the development of adverse outcomes. But when I was looking at the research between the relationship of activity level and externalizing problems, there wasn't any information on how individual changes predict externalizing problems during early childhood. Now, taking a step back, among the few latent growth models that have studied activity level, parent reports have generally found declines in activity level. What's interesting about prior research is that most studies have looked at mean level changes in the group, so whether activity level is going up or down. So parents have generally shown declines, while motion recorders have shown increases. And so you can see that there's low agreement between the measures that you're using to assess activity level. But what's interesting is that group level change, in terms of whether activity level is going up or down, does not capture individual changes in the data. What do I mean when I say individual patterns of change? Well, I'd like to demonstrate with an example made-up graph. Well, let's say we're measuring activity level from ages 3 to 5, and we've collected all of this data, and now we're going to plot the average activity level at each age. So we have our intercept, which is this average starting point, and our slope, which represents the average rate of change. Now, while general change is good to know, there's lots of variability in our data set. Kids probably are demonstrating all sorts of trajectories in their activity level, and these differences might be really meaningful, because now we can begin to ask if certain changes are predictive of externalizing problems. In other words, now we can start to identify children who demonstrate the riskiest trajectory in their activity level. And we can model this information by using something called a latent growth model. So my aims were to fit a latent growth model for motion recorded activity level, which has not been done before. I then asked if motion recorders and parent ratings predicted externalizing problems at age 5. And then I wanted to see if the change in motion recorded data was related to the change that we see in parent rated data. And this prompted me to ask if these different measures were predicting externalizing problems differently. So 620 children came into the Boston University Twin Project at the ages of 3, 4, and 5. And they spent around over 100 minutes at the lab each time they were there. While they were there, they engaged in a variety of lab tasks that were there to elicit a range of temperamental traits and activity behaviors. So some tests involve more sitting still, like taking a school readiness assessment or a cognitive battery. Other tests demanded a little bit more gross motor control, such as popping bubbles, ball games, bead sorting, toy games. And while children were undergoing these tasks, they were wearing Minimeter Actical actigraphs on their wrists and ankles. Minimeter Actical actigraphs look at both the speed and intensity of activity level multiple times a second by using accelerometers. And so what we did was we developed a composite activity score by averaging the activity on all 4 limbs at each visit. And we did this because activity level among both the legs and the arms were highly correlated. So this was a valid thing for us to do. We also asked parents to rate their child's activity level using the Child Behavior Questionnaire, which comprised of 15 statements, where parents were asked questions about their child over the last 6 months. Some example statements were: moves about actively when playing in the house, is full of energy in the evening. And when kids turned 5, we also asked parents about their child's externalizing problems. To do this, we used the Child Behavior Checklist, where parents rated their child's behaviors over the last 6 months. Some example statements were: selfish or won't share, can't sit still, restless, gets in angry moods. So I'm going to skip this slide in the interest of time, but this is essentially what the latent growth model looks like. And feel free to ask me more about this in the questionnaire. So my job was to develop a model and analyze the data. And our findings were that motion recorders showed increases in activity level. Specifically, those who had higher activity level to start at age 3 showed smaller increases over time. We also found that when we controlled for gender, there were no effects on the starting point and the rate of change. Parent ratings showed declines in activity level, and specifically there was no correlation between where you start and how much you change. But we did find that gender did affect the results, in that boys on average showed no change while girls showed declines. Among both models, there were significant individual differences in patterns of change, demonstrating that there were lots of individual trajectories in activity level. We also found that a higher starting point predicted externalizing problems at age 5. But for motion recorders, the rate of change did not predict externalizing problems, while parent ratings showed that smaller decreases predicted externalizing problems. When I covariated my two measures to compare if change in one was related to change in the other, I found that changes in motion recordings were not related to change in parent ratings. But we did find that the intercept, the starting points, were related to each other. And so this prompted me to ask if these measures were predicting externalizing problems in different ways. What I found was that parent ratings specifically uniquely predicted externalizing problems, which tells us that there might be something different that they're tapping into, as opposed to motion recorders. So overall, we found that individual patterns of change are really important in predicting externalizing problems, because now we can start to identify risky trajectories that could predict externalizing problems and help target behavioral interventions to children who need them, who demonstrate these trajectories. We also found that motion recorded and parent-rated activity level are measuring change and predicting externalizing problems differently. This could be due to a variety of reasons. For one, parents might be assessing their child across a broader range of situations. They're thinking about their child at the home, at the school, at the playground, whereas motion recorders were solely looking at physical activity level in the lab. It's also possible that these measures were tapping into different aspects of activity level. The declines that we saw in activity level for parent-rated data might show that parents were thinking about the child's self-control, their ability to sit still, pay attention in tasks, and dedicate their attention. Whereas motion recorders might be tapping into things like physical maturation, improved exploratory behavior, and more autonomy when in novel environments. So for future directions, it's important that child temperamental studies approach the studies with multiple methods to understand the nuances that different methods can actually capture when studying both activity level and other temperamental traits. Thank you.
I was curious about like any sexism maybe playing into like parents' ratings, because you said that they didn't notice change over boys versus girls, and I was curious if that was like looked into at all.
Yeah, that's a great question. So boys have generally found to show higher activity level than girls across multiple studies and lots of literature. What could be happening is that motion recorders may have not captured those differences because they were in highly standardized environments with structured tasks. Whereas when parents are considering multiple contexts that the child is usually in, those contexts might inform more gender differences. And it's also possible that during this age period, girls are declining or developing better self-control than boys are during this time. But more research is needed to understand what these trajectories look like in other ages.
All right. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for the presentation. I may be slightly repeating the question, but I find the no gender effect in the motion capture versus the parent ratings to be really, really interesting, and I find it maybe kind of similar in my mind to like likelihood of ADHD diagnoses for boys versus girls, and I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, so externalizing problems being hyperactivity, aggression, defiance, a lot of those symptoms kind of overlap with symptoms of ADHD and conduct disorder. The reason why I'm wary to make conclusions about that is because this was not a clinical sample, in that kids were not coming into the lab because they had behavioral problems or because they were overactive. But interestingly, one of the reasons why these motion recorders may not be predicting externalizing problems as much in terms of the rate of change is because prior literature showed that this tends to happen at younger ages. So increases from ages 6 to 36 months were predictive of more aggressive behaviors. And another study showed that in early ages that was more predictive of hyperactivity. So it's possible that in early age periods, there's a greater association between activity level and externalizing problems.